Okay, this talk has three parts. So firstly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, so you sort of know where I'm coming from and why I might think some of the things I think, rather than just launch into it. The second part is going to be a little bit about, well, what do we know about, what lives in gardens, and how do we know that? And, is it different to what most people think it is? So we're just there's a bit of soft ecological science, to be honest. And the third bit is going to be how I've tried to use some of these understandings and the new garden that we have not so far from here to actually try to support wildlife, but also for us too, so we can enjoy it as human beings and as everyone does with gardens. So that's what it's all about. So let's get going. If you want to know any more about me, the best way to do that is just to look at my Instagram account. And, say no more, just if you want to look, have a look type thing. So, in 1975, I was a student in horticultural science at the University of Bath. And as I found out, sort of as I started this degree course, I got really interested in horticultural plants, but I'd always been interested in native plants too, and in wildlife, and et cetera, et cetera. And something unbeknown to me is back in 1974, the first research in the UK took place at Monkswood Experimental Station near Huntingdon. To how do you make agricultural hay meadows from scratch? And this was really, really sort of fascinating to me. And this kicked off my sort of lifelong interest in actually what you might call, the dynamics of semi-natural systems, how they work, what they do, how they're managed, etc., etc. And so when I left the university, I did my PhD at Bath too. And when I cleared off, the first job I got was in Australia. And when I got there, these old slides, these are photo slides which have been digitized, so that's why I had this strange black thing around them. But I was looking around in the mid-80s for a sort of direction in research and what I was going to spend my life doing, and I found out about these surviving fragments of this very rare grassland. This is the rarest plant community in Australia. Forget about rainforest. There's loads of rainforest. The actual really rare vegetation in Australia is this grassland, which, like native wildfire meadows in the UK, was almost entirely destroyed within a 50-year period by agriculture. There's just like roadside fragments. So I got really interested in this because I looked at that and I thought, well, that's really quirky and interesting. I wonder if I could use that as a vegetation in urban spaces. And so I kicked off my work into how could you reimagine both native vegetation and non-native vegetation to make really quirky, interesting, and often very large-scale vegetation types in the public open spaces of cities. So that's what all my work's really been about. I'm going to show you a few examples of that, and so you've got a sense of me. So this is jump forward to 2008. I joined the University of Sheffield in 1995, and I start looking at these ideas really from 1995 about how can you apply these sort of these ideas derived from looking at semi-natural and natural plant communities. How can you apply those to horticultural plants in design contexts? So this is an experiment to understand how these are all South African species. How do they compete with one another? Who's left standing? Who falls by the wayside? Etc. etc. And in doing that, you produce a whole range of stuff. I mean, if you work in a university, especially research universities like Sheffield, you have to write these peer-reviewed papers which only you and that German read. It's very much a niche sort of thing. But because I always also worked in practice, from being a PhD student, I'd always worked as a consultant in design and management of vegetation in cities. And so you write this stuff for the people who make landscapes, often on large scales in cities. It's not really aimed at gardens, to be honest. It's people who do various things on a larger scale. You'll see in a second. So, so this is my contribution to the real world as opposed to the sort of rather strange world of academia, where black is white and everything else. So this book here, the one here called The Dynamic Landscape, this was picked up by the people who were doing the London Olympic Park. And so, together with a colleague at Sheffield, who I co-wrote the book with in 2004, we got picked up to actually be the lead consultants for designing the landscape vegetation at the London Olympic Park, because they saw this as a sort of vision for the future, which was about ecology, but it was also about human experience and richness and meaning and all of these things, well-being, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. So I was responsible for designing and actually making, in terms of supervising the contractors, for the native wildflower meadows at the London Olympic Park, of which we made about 12 hectares. That's 24 full-size football fields, which ran all the way through the site. And this was really radical because no Olympic Games ever used anything other than mountain turf and trees, which we kept to the very smallest amounts possible. So this was this extraordinary sort of nature landscape on this enormous scale that people moved through. We also did more horticultural vegetation. These were Olympic Gardens, and they ran for almost a kilometre through the site, and they were designed to be these extraordinary moments in time. But again, using the same principles about design and how species, these are all South African species, but we had this story about how the British came to love plants from the Renaissance. And the places they actually, this is the third stopping point. We start with Eurasia, we then move to North America, then we move to Australasia and South Africa, and then we move to China, who conveniently were going to have the next games, so it was a nice story. And of course, in doing all this sort of stuff, you have to be, you have to be really interested and fascinated by what human beings other than yourself think of these sorts of things. There's a tendency in the ecological world, if you make a meadow and, it's got one oxeye daisy over there and another one over there, and people come to look at it and they look at that shuffling rather uncomfortably, and the tendency among the ecological community is to say, what's wrong with you? Why don't we like that? And rather than say, what's wrong with you, that you do like that. And so as well as being doing biological research, I also did a lot of work as a sort of like poor quality environmental psychologist. So this is a study, this is the same place. We just made this vegetation in a park in Sheffield. We just fell off there, but whatever. Chris, we'll get it later, don't worry about it, So this the first one, this is in June. And this is 4 weeks later, the same place, but it started to flower. And when you ask 50 people every month who come through, what do they think? When there's no flowers, people are very ambiguous about it. Some people say this is awful, it's just weeds, what's it doing in this public space in Sheffield? And then a month later, everyone says it's wonderful. The same people say it's wonderful who said, what's it doing here a month earlier? And it's all just about colour. So one of the really powerful things in my work is always been using colour. Colour is a sort of Trojan horse, which everyone can, or lingua franca, that everyone can sign up to. And we're all wired to like colour. You don't have to learn to like colour. You have to learn to like the disorder of nature. But you don't have to learn to like colour. Colour's wired into us. And of course, there is lots of constructing of ideas about colour, about what is right and what is wrong and what is good and bad. But that's all just construction. It's not wired into people. You learn that stuff by reading certain books by certain people. It's the Laura Ashley effect type of thing, And we write. So that's one of these peer-reviewed papers that no one ever reads except me in the German. So this is all about this sort of these ideas, the relationship between colour and how people see biodiversity and all of these sorts of things. So I see it from both sides. I see it from an ecological side, I see it from a design side, I see it also from a human experience site, and I think that's really, really, really useful. And of course, I worked doing this sort of landscape all over the world. So I spent most of, from about 2012 to 2022 working in China on all sorts of projects. 4 million people walked through this landscape. It's in the Beijing Expo. And testing these same ideas, this was all about trying to get Chinese people interested in their native flora, etc. So you do those sorts of things. And coming back to home, this project you may all have heard of NEP, I imagine. Well, this was a cereal farm till 2000. And now it's a sort of rather extraordinary. So what you might, the concept is fit really. It's a bit like an African savanna, a thornbush savanna, managed by the agricultural proxies of native ungulates, which are now mostly extinct. So Exmoor ponies for horses, sort of old breeds of cattle for oryx, etc. And it produces this sort of landscape which is completely different. And about 2020, they wanted to have a garden there, a wilding garden, a garden which had some of these similar ecological principles in, but it wasn't entirely native, and in which the herbivores were actually the gardeners. You know, because gardening is just what ecologists call disturbance. That's any factors which reduce biomass. Gardening is just hyper-effective herbivory. A cow eats, it pulls the top off, it doesn't kill the plant. Gardening, we kill the plants, and so we use our agency to create gardens which are in ways which are far more powerful than a cow can. Does that make sense? So it was to tell those sort of stories, and that's what my bit of it's a bit like Narnia. You open this oak gate in this walled garden and you enter this completely different realm. It's a sort of fairly extraordinary experience. So I did that sort of project, and then a project I'm working on at the moment, and we're just about to get onto What Lives in Gardens. This is a project in central Melbourne. Because I am an Australian citizen as well as a Brit, and I lived in Melbourne for 10 years, I've always maintained project links with the city. And this is 20,000 square metres of new garden landscape right in the centre of Melbourne. That's the National Gallery, the Theatre Hall, the Ballet School, the new Contemporary Art Gallery in the corner, and the concert arena type here. So this is a cultural area, and so this is a project I've been working on since 2020, 2020, yeah. And we don't plant until 2027. The planting involves 500,000 plants. It's really, really big scale, and I'm just going to run you through a rather sort of cheap and cheerful sort of fly-through video, just to give you a sense of the sort of nature of this sort of experience. The real videos are absolutely lifelike, but they're embargoed. Whenever you work on these big projects, this is a $1.5 billion project. It's all controlled by the comms people, so what you can show to people is actually extremely limited in most cases. And obviously in this, we're very interested about wildlife, what's going to live in this, about the invertebrates. It's a project in conjunction with the local sort of First Nations people who historically owned the land till we took it off them. So it's a really, really interesting multi-sensory biodiversity type project. Right, so what about animal life? Till very recently, if you looked at a nature conservation plan or strategy for a British city or town, all the places where we lived and all of the gardens were just whited out. There was no, and the reason for this is because the general assumption was that nothing lives in gardens. Now, it's a really extraordinary situation because you all know from your own gardens, lots of things live in your garden. But nature conservation had convinced itself, because of deep biases, that nothing could live in those sort of landscapes. Really interesting to read this report. This is the RHS has just produced this state of gardening report. And it really tries, for political reasons as much as anything, to try to say, well, what do gardens actually do? What is their role in society? And the one really to look at, I'm not going to boo them, I'm just going to point at that. So there are almost 1 million hectares of gardens in the UK. That's 3 times the National Nature Reserve area. 50% of all British animal species live in gardens, are known to live in gardens. There are approximately 308,000, not species, but species and cultivars, taxa, of garden plants in British gardens. 308,000. There are only 350,000 wild plants on the whole of the planet, and there are only 1,000 truly native plants in the UK. So this extraordinary biological richness. You can just download it, have a look at it. It's really, really interesting. And what it shows is that gardens aren't just these rather quirky little things. These gardens are incredibly powerful things for human beings, for wildlife, for health and well-being, and social cohesion, and even economics. The gardens add 38 billion to the UK economy every year. So, really worth having a look at this. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper. This is just some work from a graph from it's not a very polished looking graph, but it's a nice clear graph. So the question is, how does plant diversity in gardens compare with semi-natural ecosystems? So if you take any gardens in any city in the UK and did some sampling work, and on this particular thing you see we've got Leicester and we've got Belfast, and then we've got this one here is the most diverse natural vegetation. This is limestone grassland, and the least diverse natural vegetation, which is acidic grassland. And what you see is if you take more samples, eventually the curve levels for the natural vegetation. And the reason for that, there's only so many species there. The really fascinating thing about gardens is the curve does not level. There are so many plants in cultivation that the curve just gets higher and higher. Now, it should theoretically eventually level, because everyone's got something different in every garden. And that gives us sort of complexity and a diversity which is essentially unknown in nature, in the natural world. Gardens are truly extraordinary ecologically because of this, just imagine, just going to go back a second. There's a bit of suburbia. Every garden will have different things in it, have some similar things. You've got all these fractals of difference at this extraordinarily small scale. We'll come back to that later on. So there's a lot of plants in gardens, especially when you stop seeing gardens as Fred owns this and you see them as a land use type, which every few metres you've got a different type. This is Sheffield, and I'm showing you this data because Sheffield was one of the most studied places in the UK in terms of its gardens. There was a big research project. And if you look at these, this is the vegetation, numbers of species per unit area within acid grassland, acid woodland. And then if you look at gardens, 438 species in 120 square metres of gardens sampled. 10 times acid grassland, twice, 2.5 times the richest UK vegetation. So, this is really fascinating. So ecologists who began to see this work, they were really staggered. And there was a whole range of various research projects. Now, the person who really launched the ship was an entomologist called Jennifer Owen. Now, Jennifer Owen lived in Leicester. She lived in a very unremarkable bungalow with a 400 square metre typical suburban Leicester garden. It wasn't designed for wildlife. It had a vegetable patch, it had a couple of trees, it had some shrub borders, it had a little bit of herbaceous planting, and it had some lawn. From 1980, she sampled invertebrates. She captured, identified, and I have to say killed, the insects in her garden on a weekly basis. And she did this for 30 years. We know more about the animal assemblages, the invertebrate fauna of this Leicester garden than any other part of the Earth's surface. This is so extraordinary. And in 2010, she published this final book, The Wildlife of the Garden, a 30-year study. Most ecological data sets are for 3 years, because that's for a PhD project. And completely unrepresentative often of what really happens. It's like a blink in a moment in time. This is my old garden in Sheffield, and in this garden, it was 250 square metres. There was 700 plant taxa in 250 square metres. Now, there's nothing else on the planet that has that sort of diversity in terms of plants. It's hyper-diversity. So gardens can be extraordinarily diverse, and that diversity is then reflected both in resources that might be available and also in terms of spatial complexity. And these things are really, really important, particularly for invertebrates, in terms of driving invertebrate diversity and density. So this is the train of thought on gardens and animal biodiversity. 1991, the second of Jennifer's books was published, the first 15 years. Quite an academic book. Some scientists at the University of Sheffield read this book. A guy called Ken Thompson was part of the research team. He's a plant ecologist as opposed to an animal ecologist, but he got together with animal ecologists. And they got about £4 million from NERC in about 2006 to look at the biodiversity of urban gardens. And the question was, is Jennifer's garden just really weird? Are all gardens like this? So they started in Sheffield, they surveyed 70 gardens. If you put bugs into Google, the Bugs Project, you will find 17 research papers from their study which you can access. And what they found is that Sheffield was just the same as Jennifer's garden. And then they got some more money, and they looked at 5 other cities, and they find those 5 other cities were exactly the same as Jennifer's garden. So this sort of invertebrate biodiversity at very high levels is actually everywhere in British gardens because of the curious characteristics of the British. We like diversity. Now what you find in Britain, you do not find in German gardens. Because German gardens are very impoverished by comparison. You find less diversity in Scottish gardens. Because Scottish people in the main are not very interested in gardening. Sorry. You can look at the data for Edinburgh. Edinburgh gets absolutely hammered compared with Bristol. I was funded to do a study called How to Increase Urban Biodiversity in Scottish Gardens in 2006, funded by Scottish Natural Heritage. And for us, the issue it wasn't about using native plants in Scottish gardens. It was actually about how do you get Scottish people to be more interested in gardening with ambition. That was the cultural challenge. Oh, sorry. Now, and then if you're going to just read one thing about biodiversity, read Ken Thompson's book on No Nettles Required. It's a joke, because the joke in the conservation areas, if you want to have a wildlife garden, you have to have nettles. Because nettles are so abundant and everywhere, having nettles makes no difference whatsoever, because they're everywhere. So you may be better to have something that's really weird from New Zealand. Chances are it'll supply some resources that nettles can't. And then there's this big study called the Urban Pollinator Study. This looks at where the urban pollinators, the invertebrate category, which has really suffered the worst over the last 50 years in response to intensive agriculture, have been pollinators, because as you may have noticed, most British rural landscapes now are more or less devoid of flowers. We've probably lost, in quantitative terms, 90% of all the flowers that used to live in the countryside because of intensive agriculture. So there's been this complete kill out, and so of course the invertebrate populations, particularly the pollinators, have crashed because there's not enough food. And this is where gardens play a really, really important role. So the urban pop, they literally went down, Oxford Street with sweep nets. They just wanted to know, where did pollinators hang out in four cities in the UK. I'll show you some data on that in a second. Just to get an idea how good gardens quantitatively are for invertebrates, this is just a page from Jennifer's book, and it may not be very easy for you to read. Got the insect groups down the side, and then it's got the number of species in the garden, the number of species in the British Isles in total, and the garden as a percentage of the British Isles. So 40% of harvest spiders were present in Jennifer's 400 square metres. There's no nature reserve in the UK has anything like these values. This is extraordinary. In a gardens full mostly of non-native species. Systems approach revealed urban pollinator hotspots. This is just one of the outputs. I'm going to show you a graph which initially looks terrifying, but just live with me for a second. Right. Along the bottom, allotment, garden, cemetery, nature reserve, park, other green space, verge, pavement, man-made surface. Can you see in each case there's like the bars get shorter and shorter as you move to the right? Yeah? You can see the patterns? I've put a helpfully little pink box around allotments and gardens, because in every case, for hoverflies, this is bee abundance, this is hoverfly abundance, how many there are per unit area, this is bee richness, the number of species in a given area, this is hoverfly richness in a given area, and in every case, the top category in terms of abundance and richness are gardens and allotments, vegetable allotments. That is a nature reserve. Now, nature reserves are many and varied, because in planning terms, nature reserves are often bits of land which were never very nature rich, but they were given over as a political gesture to nature. But nonetheless, allotments and gardens are much richer, much higher abundance, because of you. Because you're always gardening them to have more flowers, and therefore there are more resources for pollinators, and the pollinators simply respond to that. A wildflower meadow, I have wildflower meadow at home, but the season is quite short, and after I cut it, they all move to the garden. So gardens are really, really good. So what about plant nativeness in all of this? The reason gardens were whited out in nature conservation strategies was this idea, which came from a man called Wilson in the 1960s, who was a biogeography of islands person. Wilson, without any data, was convinced that native animals could only live in native plants. And this set the hair coursing. If you're talking about invertebrates, generally speaking, in the less specialised northern hemisphere biota, the southern hemisphere has much more specific relationships between invertebrates and plants. But the northern hemisphere is like this big soup. Everything's moved around for long periods of time. It's only a few million years ago that a lot of the flora of China today was actually present right the way across the UK. Do you know that? There were hippos in the Thames 100,000 years ago. So the world we live in now is only a tiny sort of moment in time, and is really weird compared to what it has been for the last 50 million years. So it's very likely that a British invertebrate today, that species was feeding on Chinese species, sort of in a warm interglacial in the UK. So the nativeness is a rather, a little bit of a wobbly custard. Now, so generally speaking, for invertebrates, particularly for pollinators, nativeness is not really important. If you actually run feeding tests with native and non-native species, which of course people like me have done, there's no pattern in terms of native or non-native. The ones they go for are the ones with the highest sugar content and the highest protein content. They vote with their wallet. Just like you go to the supermarket, which has got the best resources for you. This is also true of detritivores, parasitoids, and predators. Why would a predator care whether it's on a native plant? All it wants to do is kill other insects.
Retrieval?
Decomposing cellulose. Yeah, they don't care either. So the insects that are very tied to natives are mostly herbivorous insects, be they adults or larvae, things like caterpillar butterflies, but not moth caterpillars. Moth caterpillars are completely Catholic. But the butterfly Lepidoptera is just weird. But in California, they've all moved on to southern European weeds. They've jumped ship. So they can do it. They can jump ship when the chips are down. For vertebrate animal species, nativeness is not very important, other than native plants occur at scale. So if you want to see short-eared owls, you won't see them in your garden because they need tussocky grassland at scale. And that will mean that those plants will almost inevitably be native. But that's not the same as saying they need natives, it's just they need a structural form to live, like a bittern. You won't get bittens in your garden, really, no matter what you do, because they need X hectares of reed bed. So these scale things are blue tits, for example. The caterpillars which live on oak trees are really important for blue tits during the first few weeks of the post the chicks harvested, and they're very high protein. And so if you've got more oak trees nearby or more oak woodland, you get better fledgling. But again, that's not the same as saying, you get the point. I think you get the point anyway. So scale's important. So I'm not saying that's not important. Scale is extremely important. So native plants are extremely important at scale and extremely important for conservation in general. But in the garden context, not so much, except for these highly specialised invertebrate herbivores. If you want to read more about this, this is a series of papers done by entomologists at the RHS, a guy called Andrew Salisbury. Enhancing gardens as habitats for flower-visiting aerial insects, should we plant native or exotic? And he's on the top scientific journal, so you can just read these online. Just go to Google Scholar if you're interested in stuff. And they looked at these three major groups. This last one is just on soil surface active invertebrates. Yeah. And where the differences really came out, it's this one: plant-associated invertebrates. Native plants were better for what they looked at. But these differences were not very great, and if you increased the complexity in the planting, you began to lose those differences, and non-native plants came as good as native plants. So you could fiddle with it in the garden and sort of have your cake and eat it. If you pick up something like that, there's a very strong conscious and unconscious bias in the conservation literature. So if you're Mark Waring, you will never make any comments on which moths live on non-native plants. It's all based on native plants. So it gives the impression that these insects do not live on non-native plants. But that's just because of a cultural bias. Let me illustrate this. Great Dixter. Have any of you been to Great Dixter? A few of you? Well, this is Fergus Garrett. That's him there. So Fergus Garrett is the head gardener there, post Christopher Lloyd. Fergus's wife is a plant ecologist. Sorry, an animal ecologist. And he was always going on, there's such diversity in terms of invertebrates in this garden. And she said, well, get some money and do a baseline study and find out how many insect species really are there. So he got some money together for the Great Dixter Biodiversity audit. He could not get any professional ecologist, animal ecologist, to come to Great Dixter to do the survey because they said nothing lives there. Okay? And so what he eventually did, he actually offered the British Spider Arachnid Society to have free space at Great Dixter for their annual conference. They came, and somewhere during the morning they said, let's go out and have a cup of coffee. And they went outside, and they actually went to the compost heap and had a look around. And by lunchtime, they'd found this extraordinary diversity of arachnids, including some species hadn't been seen in West Sussex for 100 years, in the compost heap. And so then then the word ran out, of course, wow, this is amazing, you know. So he got some of the people who do these sorts of things into the tent, but he could only get them to do it by actually, you know, essentially offering them something for free because of these biases, which most people are just not even aware they hold. So why is Great Dixter? This is the richest part of Great Dixter Estate in terms of invertebrate. It's called the Pool Garden, and this is another part of the Pool Garden. It's much richer in invertebrate species than all the ancient woodlands and all the ancient meadows at Dixter, because Dixter has these two, and these were studied too. And the reason for it is the spatial complexity and the taxonomic complexity of the Pool Garden, even though it's a completely cultural construction. You know, the invertebrates don't know that. They're just using the resources. But look at it, base layer, medium layer, upper layer, taller upper layer. This spatial complexity, this is what drives this sort of resources and spatial complexity. So, if you want to make a garden that is as rich as possible in wildlife, using invertebrates as, you know, biodiversity proxies, I'm going to talk about invertebrates tonight because they're the group which are most likely to have specific longings for native species through the chemistry of what they eat. Then what you can do is, firstly, garden more ambitiously. We already know that there are big differences in biodiversity in gardens depending on the socioeconomic status of the people doing the gardening. The ones who have bigger budgets to spend, they tend to have higher counts of diversity because they have simply much more cultural. So there's an economic element to this. Talking before about whether our budgets for planting, weren't we, type thing, yeah. How much were we allowed to spend? So, anyway. So this is really, really important. So, you know, if you want to encourage people to actually conserve more biodiversity, just garden more ambitiously. So, maximise the area of planting. Get rid of that lawn, or reduce it. You just reduce it, or hard surfaces, you know. We know from the studies that, you know, pollinators, for example, there are very few pollinators in city streets because there's no food or habitat. So, you know, it's the same, and if you have enormous areas of hard surface or enormous areas of lawn, you will have lower counts of these things. Maximise spatial complexity, canopy layers stacked on top of one another. Plant a tree. Trees have the strongest statistical relationship with biodiversity in terms of invertebrate diversity. The more trees you have, the more invertebrate diversity you have. Which is why I'm a bit peeved about those crowbackers. I can't let go of it, I'm afraid. I'd like to see someone's head on the block. If I'm honest about it. Because the world I live in, you know, that we face that all the time, where people will cut a tree down because a street lamp, say, who gives a stuff about the damn street lamp? I mean, is that really important? It's not really, is it? Many cities in more progressive parts of the world, they switch the street light off at night. In Germany, you go down the street and your phone switches the lights on for you. And then you go past and then it switches them off. You know? Yes, it's sort of savages, really. Maximise plant diversity. It's fun! In landscape architecture is the discipline I spent most of my life in. They all believe, because of modernness, that less is more. More is more. That's the reality. Human beings, more is more. But you have to learn to like less. We're naturally wired to like more complexity. Don't be too tidy. You know, don't try to push cutting back stuff, you know, as late as possible in the winter. The goldfinches have discovered Petrinia scabiosifolia in my garden, and they love it. I have clouds of goldfinches. because there's nothing of the native species standing anymore, but Petrinia scabiosifolia is doing the business for them. So I'm not going to cut that down until at least January, February. Apply these ideas to gardens. Okay, so layering planting is one of the things to get flowers for longer. When I say layering, you have a base layer, you have a medium layer, you have a layer above that. It costs more because you need more plants per square metre. No point in me pretending it doesn't, it does. But what you basically have, it's really the structure of nature. So you have most of the species on the base layer because they're small and normally shade tolerant, then you have another layer stacked on top of it and another layer stacked on top of it. Spaces get greater in each layer. And you know, these are just some sketches I did for some of this vegetation at the Olympic Park. So that's the base layer. We had another layer. We had another layer. So it's getting more spatially complex, more species, until eventually you have that. So just that structure supports more life than the top structure. Does that make sense? This is the garden in Sheffield. I wanted to show you this because the garden we have here is much larger than this. And the message I don't want to give you is that you have to have a big garden to actually have support a lot of life. This garden was 250 square metres. I'm showing you the pictures really for the layering. That's it in April and that's it in July. Okay, there's a layer beneath that, either dormant or highly shade tolerant, etc., etc. And in actual fact, small gardens, if you take a hectare of small garden, which would obviously contain many gardens, and you take a hectare of, say, my garden, which would take all of it, because that's how big it is, there'd be much more diversity in the small gardens. Because there'd be more change between each garden. You know, where for me, the curve's levelled, but not in the small garden. So just to take you through it, so that's, and you can also get this fantastic change, this seasonal change. So that's in early March. That's in early April. So it's the same place each time. Okay? I photographed this garden from 30 fixed points every 10 days when I lived there. So you have these continuous, almost like video play opportunities. This is early May, same space, and that's the same space with inside the white triangle, the white box, sort of in early August type thing. Okay, so this is the sort of things, these are really fun for human beings. It means there's always something good to look at, but at the same time, there's also always resources for invertebrates and this sort of stuff, particularly pollinators. Okay, so this is where I just thought I'd end on taking you through some of the things we're doing in a few miles from here at Clayhanger. And when we first moved here, this is what there was in February 2022. And basically, it was all mown grass. And there's mown grass there, about a third of an acre, and there's about 2 acres in the field, grazed by cows. And look, it's just like everywhere else in this village, in this valley, which much of nature has really been stripped out of. It's just more of the same. And now in, these are my alien spaceship, a Garvey and aloe shelters to keep them dry in winter type thing. So this is the garden in the making. So this is the shady side of the garden, and this is just me planting it and doing these things about these layers. So I've planted about 20,000 plants in this garden, so a lot of holes. And I've grown most of them myself from seed or from divisions and this sort of stuff. I've been running a small nursery, really. But it's just to give you a sense, and there were different types of what you might call plant communities in the shade and in the sun. So it's the site conditions drive what goes where, not some sort of, it's not a trip to the V&A to look at patterns. It's not what drives it. The site conditions do. Of course, there's a strong aesthetic thing going on here, but it's not in the conventional sense of, say, William Morris wallpaper. This is, again, just looking at seasonality over time, March 2023. This is a very new garden. I mean, the first planting was in April 24. So it's only 1 year old at that point. This is the first week in April 2022, looking from the wildflower meadows in the field. April 25, just moving on, filling up the area below the terrace. Mid-June 2025. July 2025. Now look, this is really important because it's a non-stop show. The resources that pollinators want to have, I'm trying to supply them from February to November. And that's really, really important, particularly the late stuff, because natural food sources, typically in the British landscape for pollinators, is a generalisation. They are most dominant in spring to early summer, and they are least available in late summer and autumn because of the nature of our flora and what it does. Needed to show you a bit of life, just in case you thought there wasn't any. Perhaps those guys who were writing out the nature conservation strategies were right after all. They weren't, actually. And this is early September and mid-September. So the show goes on, and then mid-November there's still a few things flowering type things. So, and of course this is good for Sarah and I, because we like to look at this sort of stuff, and it's good for nature too. And that's just what it feels like on the ground with tussocky grasses in just a few days ago, actually. And of course, what I do as someone who thinks about these things and designs with these things, we use spreadsheets a lot to manage information. So this is just what's known as a phenology chart. Got the months of the year across the top, and what I got from having these images of the garden from 30 fixed points every 10 days for 3 years in Sheffield, I had a lot of data. So I could then know exactly when things stopped and started in that climate. I think they're a bit earlier here than they are in Sheffield, obviously, but nonetheless, the relativities are pretty much the same. So you can see if you want to have flowers for a long period of time, you can just say, have I got one of those and have I got one of those, to actually make sure you're still offering resources for yourself and for the invertebrates type thing. Really, I can't really emphasize this enough, this traditional idea of culture and nature being like matter and antimatter, really opposites. It's not how it is with pollinators and human beings. We're on the same page. We both want flowers. That's what it's really all about. So we're much more like that than like that. And if you know that, it's a really liberating thing. You realise you can do something positive in the world without having to torture yourself. What is some really interesting research has just come out in 2024, and your gardens reduce seasonal hunger gaps of farmland pollinators. No garden in the UK is more than 2 kilometres. No bit of agricultural land in the UK is more than 2 kilometres from a garden, according to this paper. Okay? Because we're a small place, a lot of gardens, etc. Normally there's always a house somewhere nearby. And what they found, I'll just read this to you. Timing, not quantity, of a garden nectar supply enhances bumblebee colony growth and survival in farmland. Okay, so timing, particularly the late supplies of these resources. We show that over 90% of farmland in Great Britain is within 1 kilometre of a garden, and therefore positive actions by gardeners could have widespread spillover benefits for pollinators across the country. Given the widespread distribution of gardens around the world, we highlight their important interplay with surrounding landscapes for pollinator ecology and conservation. This is a big idea. The garden is a big idea, not that humdrum thing we just thought was a little bit of a quirky joke. It's actually quite profoundly important. Right, I'm going to show you some other things from home, just to give you a sense. So this is a flyover with a mobile phone, and as I get further away, the phone judders more, because I'm trying to stretch like that, you know, like a sort of ballet dancer across a kitchen bench. So this is a house, you come in there, this is the garden. I want to keep the garden small because I'm going to fall apart and turn into compost at some point, and I don't want to have too big a garden. So most of the site is meadows and trees, because I can pay a contractor. I bought all the kit. I can pay a contractor to do it if I can't. But I can't pay the contractor to do the garden. That wouldn't be a good idea, because I have skills that I don't. So here's the main path to what's going to become the field. Yeah, it is jerking in case you think there's something wrong with you type thing, you know. And then there's a glade with small trees forming this sort of like an orchard. That's not an orchard. Okay? Again, spatial complexity. Very important. Orchards are pretty much the best conservation habitat in the UK, old orchards. Into the middle glade, and then into, the first glade, second glade, and there's a sort of runty little third glade somewhere along there, and the trees form this sort of structure. It's all sown with native wildflower meadows, 50 species, and there are various trees. Oh, I think we've got enough of that. You've got the idea, yeah? Now that's the valley we live in, and you know, I took the picture to make it sound as idyllic as possible, but in actual fact, that it's very important to separate scenic beauty from biodiversity value. Because although that valley has a pretty good bird fauna, it has a very low level of flowers in it. So it's a bit of a biological desert in terms of flowers and for pollinators. So one of the things I thought I could do is I could actually make a positive contribution to creating resources for pollinators at the larger scale, because I had this field and everything too. And you know, there's only a handful of fields in that valley which have got something like original, you know, Second World War vegetation. You know, this is very rare. Mostly it's been improved, which is a euphemism for destroyed. Okay, and short. You know, I mean, people make a living, but I mean, you know, signage production is just about the worst way to manage land for nature. Catastrophic. And that's the field when we first moved in. That's Spud the dog, and there was a very healthy relationship with frisbees, in that he won't let you have it. So frisbees have got that too much tension. And I read that book about 2021. And it's really about looking at old orchards in Hereford and Worcestershire in terms of the bird fauna they support. And I was really inspired by that. I thought, yeah, it's really interesting. I can do something with that. So anyway, got this field. Thought, I can't turn it into a garden. Even if I could, I don't want to. But I do want to convert it into species-rich meadow grassland, and I also want to have a lot of trees in it. Some of which will be native, but some of which will not be native. In fact, many will not be native. So, a lot of deer. Need to keep the dogs out, in, and the deer out. So we did that, one of the first jobs. Here's the little sketch plan, and you generally have between 5 and 15 of each species. So when the Malus hupensis, that was the tree at the beginning. Remember the Malus hupensis? We happened to have a 70-year-old Malus hupensis in the garden, or when the house was built in 1938. And so there's a mothership, Malus hupensis there, and then there were 15 others which like stitch back and forwards across the field. So when they all flower, it's like the lights come on. Okay, so these sorts of techniques are used for every species, and that's the species which are used, and and they're all species which the climate models for 2070 suggest should be able to survive. Clayhanger becomes central Brittany by 2070. The climate of central Brittany today is what Clayhanger will be in 2070. It's not such a big jump. London becomes Barcelona by 2070. There's an absolute kill-out in southeastern England coming. And many native species will disappear from the agricultural landscape. Though it's already happening now, with the birch are the first to go. So I didn't want to plant anything, really anywhere on the site, which couldn't actually get through the climate change which is coming. It's here, but it's going to change a lot more. And then this is me laying the glades out. You can draw glades on a bit of paper, but they look very different on the ground. And so actually mowing out the shapes is actually really good. That was the cow field beyond. This was a long mown grassland area, which was much less productive, much less fertile, which is good for meadows. I got a lot of my ex-students and buddies and mates came, and we planted 250 trees in a weekend. See, that dog gets in all the pictures. The dog is very keen to be memorialised. And then we converted the grass using various techniques to using the standard techniques I used at Olympic Park and all this sort of stuff here. Because my work with meadows is, it's not just to have a primula veris in every square metre. It's to have 50 primula veris in every square metre. That makes a quantum difference to how I feel and in terms of the resources. So we use an algorithm to calculate the amount of seed that I developed for this book and this sort of stuff. So we have the meadows. These are the species we sowed. Pretty much the same in the north side and the south side, because there's a little bit of difference in terms of moisture. So some of the drier species are on the top side, and some of the moister species are on the south side, where it's moister. And in the pond, there's a wildlife pond we made, and this is what the early meadows were looking like in 2024. This is 2 years after sowing. So now this is 2025, so you begin to get a sense that, hey, the Malus hupahensis, the children of the lost, they are now flowering. I grew those from seed, so they're now 5 years old, they're now 3-4 meters tall, and you begin to get a sense of structure in this rather Elysian sort of appearance. So it's sort of going to plan. I worked very hard to keep enriching it. We plant 3,000 P7s every year of species we want more of, things like Trachelium, Campanulus trachelium, and this is what the meadows are beginning to look like. Yeah, okay, so obviously I have to manage it. In ecology, there's the thing that drives positive change in ecosystems in the longer term is a thing called disturbance, and the disturbance here is hay making. So this is my little baler and my little cutter. I've removed the cutting bar on the blue thing, and then you put the baler on, makes these nice little bales. And if you want to buy one of these, don't tell your partner what the price. Okay? Just say it was really good value. But without this, because my trees are only 4 to 5 meters apart, so I can't use agricultural scale machinery, and I can't use grazing because the trees are too small. And I generate about 200 bales. I cut normally in late June, early July, which is a bit earlier than most people do, but by then I get a very major secondary flowering in September and October, which is, as you will gather, is really important for a lot of invertebrates and birds, seed heads. Getting rid of hay is the issue. How do you get rid of it? No one wants it. I mean, the modern cow doesn't eat hay. It just eats this sort of like this green slop, which is being chopped up. But David, actually, the local farmer, he did actually quite want the hay this summer because it was prime and hay was getting very expensive. So David did take some, but I normally give it to animal rescue, whose animals are far less judgmental about hay. And the final slide, so 3 years post-planting. So this is in October, and you can see the flowers. in October, resulting from that late June, early July hay cut. And we're beginning to get the structure, and a lot of these trees I planted had very good autumn colour. They were selected for that. So you get this multi-seasonality. And the invertebrates don't really care about the autumn colour, but we do. And that's a fair deal, I think. So finally, in conclusion, gardens are good for wildlife, even gardens in which the owners have no interest in wildlife. So even if you're not interested in wildlife, your garden will contain wildlife, and more wildlife than you can possibly imagine. They can be very, very good as the best native nature reserves for the species that can live in that spatial, structural sort of type of landscape. You won't get any short-eared owls or bitterns. There you go. You don't have to abandon nature to achieve this. This is a complete nonsense. Ken Thompson's book, No Net Was Required, was constructed to tell you that. It's in your hands. Thank you.